Hello, class, and now we're covering chapter 13 on Renaissance theater, and covers a wonderful period of our Western civilization, and we cover four really great countries in the order of Italy, and then England, and Spain, and France, all during the Renaissance. A wonderful time of growth and tremendous uh, development in the world of theater. So let's get right to it. So Italy in the Renaissance, there are lots of advances. Look at this as an indoor theater, but it looks a lot like the outdoor theater. So this is a transition to the indoor proscenium theater that we are familiar with now. This was the Teatro Olimpico, 1584. There was wonderful architecture, scenery, painting, neoclassicism, which is basically trying to redo the Greek and Roman ideals. There was opera, which we don't get into, but there was a lot of wonderful sets involved in the opera. And of course, the music. And commedia dell'arte, which was a kind of a street comedy form that carried on, and tradition carries over into today. We saw clips of Lucille Ball earlier in the talking about styles and farce. That's right from commedia. So this first proscenium theater was a Teatro Farnese in 1618, and look at how it looks when you look down on it, how deep it is. This is the orchestra, so you would be standing right here looking out. You'd be looking this way. So you're standing there looking out that way. And so that's the curved seating. But look at this pit here. And I'm not sure if it was a seating pit or an acting pit, but look how deep it all is. And then the stage also goes way, way back. And this is different from the Greek and Roman times, where you basically played everything right here at the front of the proscenium, right here at the front of the proscenium, and then didn't have all this depth. You had wings and shutters. So those were panels that slid back and forth, basically like sets, drops or hard drops that slid back and forth. You had indoor lighting, obviously, because it's indoor. So you had oil lamps, and then again they had been shuttered, so you could have light control. So if it was needed to be brighter or darker, so even then you had rudimentary lighting control. And this was a wonderful period for art. We started getting perspective scenery. You can see the perspective point back there. If you took art approach, you would see we talk about perspective, and there's even multi-point perspective. And the scene changes when there was some technology involved. Back to the previous slide, you could just have stagehands slide these shutters back and forth. But now Torelli has an idea to go underneath the stage. There's slots in the stage floor that have these wagons that you winch with a pulley system, and basically you slide this, so you could have like maybe just a couple people, or like 4 or 5 maybe, to do the set changes instead of 20. So again, using technology and machinery as much as possible. Now the academic world really insisted on trying to stay with the Greek ideal of these 3 unities of time, place, and action, which is okay, but it gets kind of boring. So that's really where it all started, basically from the Greek and Roman times. And then during the Renaissance, people are starting to break away from that, as we saw in the Christian one acts, the little biblical set scenes. They broke that up and were doing all kinds of things. This was a prescriptive theory that the academics liked, but not necessarily a crowd pleaser. The biggest influence we'll see was in France, that really tried to adhere to that. In fact, they had a whole Académie Française that really policed the plays. But you have the rise of commedia, which again, this goes back to the traveling troops that had always been around, even in the early classical times, the gypsy troops, the street performers. And basically, it was a group that they would tour Europe on their wagons. It would be a company with a couple of wagons, and they would go from town to town and play. And they played, the scenarios they played were actually maybe written scripts that were taken from some of the Roman comedies. And basically, but again, people weren't reading scripts, so they were just making it up. So typically the troupe, the same person, the player would play a typical character, like they'd be the servant, they'd be the young lover, or they'd be the old man, you know, they'd be the doctor, they'd be the, so they kept a character, they basically played the same character. Same thing is if you're in a long-running series where you're playing the same character for, you know, literally 8 seasons. It's the same kind of thing. So you just learned your character. And they used comic bits like Lazzi. Lazzi, that's Italian for like a comic bit, like the thing about the fly buzz. There's a, you know, and then these are things that you could throw in any play, like the bit with the fly. There's a fly, you know, you're in the middle of a scene and you know, and you're just improvising stuff. Well, there's the thing with the fly, and you know, and hitting yourself and stuff like that. And you can see from these little wood cuttings here, they were quite, you know, raw. This is someone getting an enema. This is a doctor, you know, taking someone's teeth out with these big pair of tongs. So the comedy was really low and base, but crude and probably funny. These are the stock characters. These are the servant Scapino, Pantalone, and then the Dottore and the Capitano. These are the masters. And the Harlequin was the servant, and the lovers were they were not in masks. These people all had half masks on. The lovers were typically the young people of the company, and they did not wear masks. I do have a little clip here from Scaramouche. I'm going to play you a little bit of this. This is a version that was like done in 1940s. It was a 1940s film. And this is the closest thing I could find to what it might look like in those days, even though with the 1940s Hollywood, the production values are a lot better than what you'd see on the street in Italy. So let me pull this up. So yeah, lots of physical humor. Falling down. And the whole conceit was Scaramouche was actually hiding out in this troupe, not a real actor. So the idea of this was that he was just playing the buffoon as a role. And that was a slapstick. So when the term slapstick comedy, there's a hinged stick that folds like that and becomes slapstick. So you can see that's the style of comedy from that period. Then we go on to Renaissance English theater, and this was the golden age here, London 1500 to 1600. London went from a town of about 50,000 to about 200,000 in that century. There was a big flourishing of culture and commerce, and the whole thing about Renaissance was that it happened because the world was open and people were trading, and so there wasn't a lot of war. People were killing each other, so that allowed the arts to flourish. So this was also a period for Queen Elizabeth, and what she did was there was a division between religious theater and just secular theater before she took reins, and so she clamped down on religious theater and basically said, no, we're going to license it, and we can't do religious theater because of the whole break between the Protestants and the Catholics. So she ruled that out. So what happened was then you had this growth of all this the secular and non-religious theater. So that was a very flourishing time, and obviously it was the time of Shakespeare, which we get to Shakespeare, and Shakespeare arguably is the most famous English-speaking playwright. In America, there's probably a Shakespeare festival in just about every state in this country. Why, you may ask? Well, his characters are timeless. His plotting is good. It's kind of intricate. Sometimes you have to follow along what's going on. There's lots of subplots. But again, this is not your climactic, one place, one character, 6 characters, one place. Lots of characters, lots of subplots and counterplots, lots of fun language. Shakespeare could do low comedy, he could do high drama. So he really did all. He did about 35 plays, and they're all still in production. Obviously, some of the most popular ones, the Romeo and Juliets and the Hamlets and things like that. But you've got some examples of some plays that I've selected for you to view and do a response sheet to in this unit. The stage, and actually we saw a clip of the stage. I showed you some of the Romeo and Juliet from the Shakespeare in Love when we looked at stage types. And that would be the same clip here, so we're not going to go back over that. But again, these were the cheap seats then. Now, the whole role of the orchestra changes. Here the orchestra is just, people are standing up and they're throwing, vegetables if they don't like you. There was an inner above that was up here, and this is the inner, so this is sheltered, so this is inner above and the inner below. And with an open stage like this, you could make it anything. This could be a tree, you could be in the forest of Arden, these could be pillars, you could be doing Julius Caesar. So so the action moved very quickly, and that's one of the things about Shakespeare, why he's still contemporary, because his scenes are not super long, they're still kind of cinematic, they flow, and Shakespeare can be trimmed because his plays are a little bit wordy. There are also court masks for people who didn't just want regular plays. They just wanted, and these were rich people, these were the dukes and the duchesses and the lords. They would say, hey, why don't you just write me something for after dinner? We just want some music and some, beautiful women dancing and maybe some little music, dance, some poems, some movement, something kind of very, easy on the eyes. So this was a money-making proposition too. Ben Jonson, who was a famous playwright in the Renaissance, made some money doing the court masks, which are sort of little vignette plays, but they're very professionally staged, and also an opportunity for the scenic designers to get a lot of work. For instance, Inigo Jones, in that period, was one of very famous designer, and he went to Italy to learn from the Italian designers. And he was the premier designer of the English-speaking era. And here's some lithographs of a set that he had created. So, this was his set design, this was his costume. So designers started getting more work then too. Then we go on to Spain, the golden age of Spain, 1580. Now notice, Shakespeare's time, this was a little bit later than Shakespeare's era, but again, this was followed right on the heels. So Spain became united in 1469, and Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. Ferdinand and Isabella were the king and queen. During this 100-year period from 1580 to 1680, 10,000 plays were created in Spain. This is a united Spain, and since it's monotheistic, it was a Catholic country, there was none of the kind of rivalry and schisms that you had in England, because the Catholics and the Protestants weren't fighting each other because there were no Protestants. It was all Catholic. So the church obviously was very powerful and very wealthy, and they promoted religious plays, and so there was a money-making proposition too for playwrights to make religious plays. And the comedias were popular. They were like the Shakespeare plays because they were episodic. Just because it's a commedia doesn't mean it's like ha ha ha. Basically, it's a romance that ends well. So if it's a commedia, there might be struggle and drama, but at the end, the hero wins the girl, that sort of thing. The type of space is very similar to the old globe, the globe that we saw from the previous slide. Basically, it's an open space. It was actually, many of them were done in hospital patio areas, the inner courtyards, because it's a warm weather country, and so there was a lot of outdoor movement. So you can see there's an awning over here, but in the inside the hospital, There's the open space, and then people would sit, and the expensive seats were up here on the sides and the balcony. And at the back of the theater was a cazuela where the unmarried women would be chaperoned. But this type of staging was very fluid and open too, because it was very spare. You know, a chair, you know, a trunk, something like that to suggest a scene. So the scenes would move very fluidly and with not a lot of furniture. Lope de Vega was really considered the Shakespeare of his country. He wrote prolifically 800 plays. And if you do the math, if you figure he had a career for 50 years, that's about 13 plays a year, if my math is correct. Let's see, that's 50, that's you know, 5 and then 30 and 5, you know, 16 plays a year. That's 16 plays a year. So that's 16 into, that's about cranking out a play about every 3 or 4 weeks. And so it's a living. He made money, and the actors made money too. So Lope de Vega was popular. He mixed comedy and tragedy. His action was unified, but it went all over the place. His most famous play was called The Fuente of Juna, or the Sheep Well, kind of like the sheep dip. Like basically it's a little town. So what happened is a girl became wronged. She was attacked by a major or someone who was higher up in the military, and basically raped her. So her lover, who was a peasant boy, was outraged, and the town was outraged. So they basically killed this guy. And word got around to the king and queen that this action happened, and so they sent the judges and the inquisitors into that town. And the town held firm. They did not budge. When they were questioned, they say, who did it, who did it? People would say, Fuente of Juna did it, Fuente of Juna did it. So what happens at the very end was the king and queen hear about this, and they hear about the valor of this town. And so they become the heroes. So in Spain, it's a celebration of the common man. It's a celebration about the unity of a town and standing up for the right thing. So it's a wonderful play, and it gets played in the Latin countries. And Calderón de la Barca was more of a serious, meditative, spiritual playwright, a very good craftsman. He was interesting in the sense that his play Life is a Dream really started dealing with the dream world. There was where this prince was thrown into jail and imprisoned. I think his father was jealous of him, and he was in prison for a long time, and kind of suffered. And then at one point he was freed, and then kind of came out and then said, well, it was all a dream. So this whole thing about life is a dream, this whole idea about, you know, what's real and everything. This was in the 1600s, introducing this kind of dream world concept. De la Barca went to priesthood later. He wrote for the Spanish autos sacramentales, which are the Spanish, the Latin religious plays, the biblical plays. And since it was a Catholic country and very well funded, those plays were very elaborate and they were professional. This was not you didn't have the amateurs and just the volunteers. People were getting paid for this, and very massive. Look, this is a cart here that was a rolling cart. The sets could be as tall as 36 feet high, rolling down the street on 4 wagons, massive structures with the actors. So it was a very big thing in the Catholic Spain. Then finally we have France in the Renaissance. And the Renaissance came later to France because of wars. They were fighting, people were fighting. But it finally did come. It was France got calmed down. And again, the important thing about France is it was very heavily influenced by this neoclassical idea about time and place and these really more rigid structures. So their plays tended to be more like the comedias, with these characters, these buffoonic characters, these stereotypes. If you did not produce your play that way, you would be shut down. It was very strictly controlled. the most famous playwright and really one of the greatest comic playwrights of the Western world was Moliere. And like Shakespeare, he grew up as an actor, traveled around, worked in a company, learned his craft. His comedies was, he was always making fun of characters, hypocrisy, the doctor in spite of himself, the imaginary invalid, someone who's a hypochondriac. And his most famous play was Tartuffe. And Tartuffe was someone who was pretending to be a cleric, a religious person. So he came into a household and wormed his way into a household, but basically he was a charlatan. And here's a scene from Tartuffe where the lady of the house is, I think, accosting, maybe it's her husband, after because Tartuffe was trying to make advances on her. There's a very famous scene where she hides under a table, or no, her husband hides under the table, and Tartuffe is making advances on her, and she's trying to, get her husband, who's very gullible, to notice, and she's like pounding on the table and stuff. So it's kind of that kind of comedy. I've got a little clip from a Commedia dell'arte company. Not that it's always done like this, but this will give you, it's a very physical comedy. Their take on it is this very kind of physical commedia style. So you can get a look at this. Whoops, not that. Kind of exaggerated physical mannerisms, stylized commedia characters. Physical and stylized. So that was what Tartuffe, that's what Moliere was looking for in his plays, his productions. There's also very serious, it seems like there were lots of great playwrights in this era, but if there's a comic playwright, there's always a good serious one. And Racine was a very famous tragic playwright. And again, he covered a lot of the Roman tragedies, which were covered from Greek tragedies. Like, for instance, Phaedra was a play about a queen who falls in love with her husband's son. It's a second marriage, so it's a stepson. Husband goes away to war, and they hear that has died. So the queen has already harbored lustful thoughts for the son, and it turns out king is not dead. Comes back and finds out. So it's a tragedy. Everybody probably dies at the end. But neoclassical craftsmen, new versions, and very poetic. The great dramas are poetry. It's poetry. So in that era, there wasn't radio, there wasn't television. People came to hear a play, and not just see it, but to hear it, hear the poetry. It's like you'd listen to a song. Or you go to opera, you could shut your eyes and just hear the beautiful music. And there were some interesting, theater has always been kind of a stepchild that sometimes they make do is where do you put a theater? So the first French theater was in the Hotel de Bourgogne, and these tennis court theaters were basically, tennis was big in France. So what they did was they converted some tennis courts, which are kind of looking long and narrow, into these theaters. Put seats here and then and a stage at the end. But then they shifted and went to proscenium theaters in the 1640s. And then now what's going to happen is all across Europe, the proscenium theater comes out of, becomes the standard, moving away from just the wagon stage and the kind of the Shakespearean globe where you just have you suggest a set with just an empty stage, and in the Corrales Theater in Spain. So you get these kind of theaters. these huge, massive theaters, very ornate. This theater is still in existence. The Comédie Française is one of the, I think it's the oldest continuous repertory company in the Western world. But notice, look at the audience here. Look at the audience on stage. So people would sit, it's not just watching the show, they want to be part of the show. So obviously these were expensive seats because people went to the theater to see and be seen. And so this is where theater, now we're getting theater, this could be a Broadway theater nowadays even. So the elaborate proscenium stage has now kind of reached its prime. And I believe that's everything we've got. So that is chapter 13 on the Renaissance. We'll see you next time.